We've been talking the last several weeks about the content of the prayer book and the organization of the prayer book and the way in which the content and the organization tell us important things about the faith and practice of the Episcopal Church, right? What is it about the book itself and the way the book is arranged and the material that's in the book that is suggestive of a particular vision for the life of faith, a particular kind of spirituality? That's where we've been the last couple of weeks. At the end of our session last week, we stepped back and said, well, where do we want to go from here? And we heard a couple of things. We heard that we want to spend a little bit more time looking at the spirituality of the Psalms as it relates to the office, the experience of God in daily life. And we also wanted to talk a little bit about the 39 articles and the relationship of the articles to kind of the development of the prayer book. So we're going to start with the second of those. I want to look today at the history of the prayer book a little bit, the means whereby we got the book that we have. And I want to tie that to the articles and the emergence of the articles and the nature of the articles, because those two things kind of go together. And the reason they go together is that the process, when we look at the history of the book, the development of the book, the unfolding of the book, that process itself is one of the means that Anglicans believe that God speaks to the church, right? So attention to the history of the book is in some respects us attending to how we believe God is moving in and through the church to move us forward in the life of faith, right? As we move deeper into the worship of the church, as we wrestle with what it is the church believes and how we articulate what it is the church believes, and how belief bears on our experience of worship, and how worship bears on our experience of daily life, and how all those things fit together, there emerges what we might call a tradition. And that tradition itself is one of the vehicles through which God's Spirit speaks to the church and draws the church into a particular direction, into a particular relationship with Himself. I start with that because we're going to be kind of bouncing back and forth in today's discussions between a variety of different points. We're going to talk about kind of the history of Anglicanism and the history of the prayer book itself. We'll spend some time talking about doctrine. You know, when did Anglicans believe it was important to articulate the Eucharist or their understanding of the Eucharist in this particular way as opposed to that particular way, and why the difference is there. We'll spend some time, obviously, talking about worship. How was the church's experience of worship? How did that shape their reception of the prayer book, their reception of the traditions of the church? How did all of those pieces fit together? I mean, you heard me say the first day that we started this series that there's really no way of just looking at the prayer book in and of itself without simultaneously trying to attend to a number of different complementary but nonetheless distinct areas of whatever we might want to call it, areas of concern. You've got faith and practice over here, and spirituality over here, and worship over here, and the individual life of faith over here, and corporate experience of the life of faith here. All that stuff kind of fits together and shapes what we call the prayer book. So we're back to that discussion, right? We're back to the intersection of all those different points of contact. And what I want to focus on today specifically is the process through which we got the prayer book. What is it we believe God was doing through that process? What did we learn as a consequence of that process? In other words, why do we worship the way that we worship as a result of that process? And then we'll fold our consideration of the articles into that broader historical discussion. What is it that the articles in particular tell us about Anglican faith and practice? And how does the emergence of the articles sit alongside the emergence of the prayer book? Does that make some sense? So we're kind of looking at these two conjoined processes through which we have come to receive as not necessarily, certainly not competing, complementary forms of authority and of tradition. We've got the prayer book over here, we've got the 39 articles, and they have some relationship with one another. That's what we want to look at today. So you may, in addition to having the outline in front of you, you may want to just go ahead and open up your prayer books to page 867. And page 867 is where the articles begin. We're not going to go through all the articles. There's a lot of questions that might emerge if we were to just take some time to tease through the articles and look at what each of the articles says about any of the topics. I commend them to you. I commend take a look at them, read them sometime, read through them. But they all are intended to address specific concerns and specific questions that arose at a particular point in the life of the church, right? So they were not necessarily expected to be or held to be timeless. David, do you have one there?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And just as a way of kind of highlighting that fact, note, please, that the articles are included in that section of the prayer book known as the historical documents. Now that's interesting, and I just got there by turning back 2 pages. That's interesting. Immediately before the historical documents is the catechism, right? What Episcopalians believe about the faith. So right there, the organization of the book suggests something. If you want to learn what Episcopalians believe today, would you necessarily go to the articles? Well, they're there, they're in the book, but they're positioned in a particular way, right? They're kind of offered up as an example from the history of the tradition that provides us with a benchmark. This was at one time considered to be a more or less fulsome articulation of the faith. But now the catechism gives us something slightly different, right? So simply in the way the book is organized, we put these two things kind of in tension with one another. Here we have a catechism that is not focused on the same kinds of questions as the 39 articles. It does not go into nearly the detail on some of those questions, as does the articles. But the articles are still there. So one thing that is profitable for Episcopalians always to be doing is to kind of bounce back and forth between different sections of the book and try and ask themselves, well, how does this part of the book inform that part of the book? And I mean, you've heard me say this before, we can do that with every part of the book. How does our understanding of baptism inform what we think is happening at the Eucharist? And how does our understanding of the Eucharist inform the way we think about baptism? And how does our relationship between those two things inform the way we think about ordination? And vice versa. It's that constant kind of shuttling back and forth between the different points that something like clarity, hopefully, begins to emerge. Right? So we've got the articles there, page 867. We'll glance at those as we go through the historical stuff. But let's turn now to the outline. What you will see here is that I've broken this outline up into 3 very big chunks. On the first side, we have the first chunk, the heading of which is antecedents. What are some of the background out of which English Christianity and the prayer book emerged? Then we talk about the English prayer book specifically, major features of the development of the English BCP. And then on page 2, the third section, we get to the American prayer book. And the thing that I want to emphasize here is that you need to see all of these as standing in continuity with one another, right? It is not the case that the 1979 Book of Common Prayer descended upon General Convention from a cloud, up in heaven somewhere, and a choir of angels said, use this, and Convention ratified it and we were done, right? There was a very long process of development and reception. And that process goes all the way back to those antecedents that you'll see listed in the first section. So what I want to do is I want to just kind of hit some highlights in each of these sections and kind of point out where some of the key benchmarks are as a way of highlighting how we got to where we are. The closest historical antecedent is kind of Western Christianity writ large, right? What you might call the Western Rite or the Latin Rite. Going further back even than that, we do see a whole bunch of stuff that shows up even before the time of Jesus himself. Christian worship, first point here, Christian worship is grounded in some respects in Jewish worship. Our understanding of the worship of God as something that shapes our daily lives, as something that shapes our individual experience and our corporate experience, as something that shapes our seasons and the way that we experience time in the calendar, all of that is not stuff we made up. That's something that we received from Israel. Because Jewish worship was the context within which Christian worship first emerged. So if you were to go back and look at some of the Jewish antecedents, you'd want to look at the way in which Jewish temple worship shaped the faith and practice of Israel, the emergence of the synagogue as a distinct place of worship and the relationship between synagogue and temple, the practice of religion in the home, the practice of the faith of Israel over the course of the calendars, right? The lunar cycles, the agrarian cycles, the religious cycles. There were any number of different calendars that Israel kind of bound together in a single unified experience over the course of a given year. And all of these begin to manifest themselves in the Jewish readings and prayers that start to get collected even before the time of Jesus, but then are really kind of codified around the 8th and 9th century of the Common Era. So that really, I mean, if you wanted to say, well, what's the ultimate foundation for the prayer book? It's that. It's the faith and practice of Israel. And it's the context, that's the context within which Christian worship, as a distinct form of practice and as bearing witness to a distinct faith, it's out of that context that all of that begins to emerge. And we see that, next point, beginnings of Christian worship, we see that in a couple of different resources. There's the resources that I've listed there include things that show up in the scriptures themselves, chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians, all the way to resources that don't really come into existence until the 4th, 5th, even 6th centuries. So the worship of the church is something that the church itself is very much concerned with, trying to figure out during the first 200, 300, 400 years of its existence. Why are we doing this in this particular way? How do we think this is leading us deeper into an understanding of what we believe God has done in Jesus, and how is it likewise leading us deeper into an ongoing relationship with Jesus? Examples of that include the Didache. There's a catechism that includes instruction for worship. You know, when you get together, you should be doing this. Justin Martyr in his First Apology, the book as a whole, the First Apology is Justin's kind of defense of Christian faith and practice to the pagan world. This is what Christians believe. This is why we're not a threat to the empire. This is why we're friendly. You should stop persecuting us. Justin's apology includes descriptions of Christian worship and Christian rites. Like he'll say to some of his pagan neighbors, you hear that when Christians get together, we do horrible things like eat body and blood. Oh goodness, what's that about? What are we doing? Are we cannibals like you've heard? No, indeed we are not. We're doing this. Right? Justin has to kind of explain things. The apostolic tradition, the Itinerarium Egeria is an interesting one. That is actually a letter that was written by a woman who went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and she wrote a letter home saying, here's what I saw people doing. These are the practices that I saw the Christians engaged in Jerusalem during Holy Week. This is how they observed this part of Holy Week. This is how they observed that. So that's fascinating for us because it gives us a really good historical snapshot of what was actually going on the ground in Jerusalem at that time during the 4th century. Then you get the developments of the different liturgies that are especially now associated with the Eastern Church. The Divine Liturgy associated with St. Basil, St. John Chrysostom, St. James. All of that stuff represents the very rich ferment of liturgical worship within the context of the early life of the church. And the Western Rite begins to kind of grow out of all of that. When we start to track specifically towards the emergence of Western Christianity, the liturgical reforms of Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th and 7th centuries, very important there. The attempts made by Charlemagne to try and standardize a particular form of worship throughout his empire. You know, there were kind of local, regional variations, and this part was doing this thing, and this area over here was doing some other thing. And Charlemagne comes along and says, no, I need you all doing the same thing, because that will help unify the empire. And then, most important perhaps for our purposes, the liturgical reforms that were initiated by Osmond of Salisbury takes all the local and Roman rites that were kind of in practice in southern England at the time, the regional practices, and marries those to the northern French or the Norman practices that were being observed, and kind of codifies that in what becomes recognized as a distinct liturgical tradition. And that's usually referred to as the Sarum Rite. Sarum is a shorthand for the Latinized form of Salisbury. And by the 15th century, the Sarum Rite is pretty much in use throughout all of England. Now, we're still a long way from the English Reformation. Right? We're still a long way from, worship in the vernacular of the people and all that kind of stuff. But the Sarum Rite the liturgical reforms that are undertaken at Salisbury, especially under Osmond, but then afterwards as well, begin to kind of represent, okay, now there's something interesting going on, liturgically speaking. We're starting to see the emergence of a particular liturgical tradition here. Okay, so I did all that very fast. Any thoughts, questions? Anybody want to kind of stop for just a moment and look at any of that any more closely? That's true. None of the, well, yes and no. There are bits and pieces of some of those things that are in the Book of Common Prayer. Certainly the Psalter, right, goes back to Jewish worship. Some of the elements of the Divine Liturgy, for example, Eucharistic Prayer D is basically a westernized version of the prayer of St. Basil. So if you were to compare the Divine Liturgy of St. Basil the Great and line that up right with Eucharistic Prayer D, oh my goodness, these are almost identical. Some of the formulations of some of our earlier prayers bear remarkable similarity to some of what we see going on in the Sarum Rite at Salisbury, and that looks like some of the stuff that we see going on in northern France, the Norman Church, prior to the emergence of the Sarum Rite. So there's bits and pieces of it kind of scattered around throughout the prayer book. Yeah. But I mean, you're right to say that the prayer book resembles, as a whole, none of those. Right? I mean, you're not going to find in any of the liturgical reforms of Pope Gregory the Great or anything Charlemagne tried to do or in the Didache or whatever, you're not going to find anything right there that says, okay, turn to page 299 and there's the rite for baptism. That's much later. How to address it? Which things are we going to leave to people's conscience? Which things are we going to insist on? Uniformity. And how does all of this bear on the faith and practice of the church? The question of the emergence of the art, or the development and the emergence of the questions that are embodied in the articles is happening at the same time as the prayer book is coming into existence. And both of those involve this dance, this coordinated dance of all the questions that people are thinking about, having to do with the nature of the church, the nature of salvation, the place of tradition, the relationship between the church and the state. All of that is part of the mix. So it is by no means the case that the English prayer book emerges because a couple of English clerics get together and decide, let's just do this in English. What do you think? And they just, translate some stuff and make something up and put it out. Everybody, that looks good. This is a very tumultuous time.
I think it's important to note here that all this comes out of Parliament.
Well, but you're right. It all comes out of Parliament, but keep in mind the bishops are involved in Parliament. I mean, right? The bishops sit in Parliament, right? There is at this point such a close working relationship between church and state, which was, that was the default setting for the time. Everybody did that, right? There was such a close working association between the two that there was sometimes a confusion about the relationship between ecclesial and temporal power. And these issues about church apportionments and Ecclesiastical Appeals Act and all that kind of stuff, that's what that's about. They're trying to clarify what is the nature of the church? How is the church like other human institutions? How does it sit alongside the crown, alongside Parliament? Is it an organ of the state, or is it something else entirely? And other people are engaged in reforming efforts, and they're answering the same questions in different ways. Anabaptists, for example, just to kind of push it to the opposite extreme, Anabaptists are saying, we have nothing to do with the state. The state is the world, right? That's out. That's the devil's domain. We are a people set apart. Jesus Christ calls us out from the world, calls us out from the state. We are to be a light on the hill, right? We are to be the salt of the earth. And to do that, we step back as a covenanted people, and we hold ourselves apart from society. Well, that looks pretty revolutionary, right? If you do that within a particular social and cultural and political context, and you get a group of people now setting themselves apart and saying, we no longer recognize your authority, that kind of looks like sedition. So what do you do with those people? Well, how do we treat them? Do we treat them like a threat? Or do we treat them as if they're just kind of off in the corner doing their own, All of these theological questions have political ramifications. And the same is true for us today. I mean, we're not free of that. We're just used to having those questions answered for us in a particular way. Right? It's so much a part of the way that we grew up that we just kind of take this stuff for granted, but not for much longer.
Luther, so is this pre-Luther?
This is actually happening a little after Luther. Things in England get going a little bit after Martin Luther's. The Reformation on the continent is kind of off and running. And the English are a little horrified by what they see going on the continent. I'm maybe overstating that just a little bit. But one of the concerns that the English have, because they see not only the disruption that it's causing to the life of the church on the continent, they also see the disruption that it's causing socially and politically. And they're like, we don't want any part of that. I mean, that's disruptive. So how do we now negotiate Reformation? How do we, especially once you've separated yourself, if you're going to go the same road that Luther does and Calvin does and everybody else, if you're going to reject the Roman Catholic Church and reject the authority of the Pope, how do you do that without falling into the turmoil that we see unfolding on the continent?
But then don't they all have another Reformation, Protestant?
Oh, Wesley is considerably later, and Wesley, God bless him, Wesley never wants a Reformation. Wesley always envisioned that what he was called to do was initiate a reform movement within the church. Wesley was never, and in some respects that's very Anglican, right? That's very Anglican, because Episcopalians, Anglicans wanted to be Reformed Catholics, right? As Reformed Catholics, we never sought to separate ourselves from the broader stream of Western Christianity. We saw ourselves as being a reform movement within the church. Wesley picks up on that same trajectory and says, yeah, the time has come again for us to be a reform movement. We want to encourage a level of piety that has hitherto not been embraced. But that doesn't mean we're separating ourselves from the church. I mean, Wesley dies a good Anglican. So this tension, these issues, these questions we're talking about are in no way, shape, or form unique to this particular period. These are questions that Christians throughout the ages wrestle with. What does change is the degree of, whatever you want to call it, turmoil, controversy, whatever the cultural, historical conditions are that kind of bring those questions to the surface, and then we kind of, find a path of resolution and we're good for a while. And then all of a sudden something happens and now we're right now in the life of the church, we're kind of at an inflection point where some of these questions are starting to emerge again. What is the relationship between the church and the state in contemporary North America? That's changing rapidly. Okay, in the interest of time, let me just kind of push forward, and we can come back and talk a little bit more if we want to. You'll see that we've got several editions of the prayer book, starting with 1549. We go through 1552. Mary Tudor comes along, tries to restore Sarum rite usage. Then she's out, Elizabeth is in. 1559, we get a reestablishment of the prayer book. 1604, we have a new prayer book issued. And then finally, 1662, Act of Uniformity, again, ratifies the new prayer book, largely a repetition of the 1604. That is still, the 1662 is still the, quote, official prayer book of the Church of England. Now, I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that since that time, they have developed other resources, other supplemental resources. So you now go into an English church and you've got a shelf full of books that you can select from, but the prayer book, boom, right there, 1662. Sometimes the reasons were good and sometimes the reasons were less than honorable. Turning then quickly to the American Prayer Book. Where did we get our... Well, as you can imagine, all of the questions having to do with the relationship between temporal power and ecclesial power, church and state, all of that, they all come up again following the American Revolution, right? Because if you're an English citizen and you're part of the established political, social, religious order, and now your country has declared themselves free of the tyranny of the crown, now what? what does that mean, again, for the relationship between temporal authority and ecclesial authority? Does the king still appoint bishops? Well, no, because the king is no longer over the church. The American church has to figure out how to proceed. And that whole process unfolds in, remarkably similar way. The questions are remarkably similar in both contexts. The answers are different, but the questions are not at all dissimilar. The first American prayer book shows up in 1789, and it is based largely on the English prayer book of 1662. The other thing that happens here, once we start recognizing, we being the American church, once the American church recognizes that we need bishops, and now we've got a problem, because the only way you can get a bishop consecrated in Anglicanism is to have one consecrated by other bishops. And part of the consecration of a bishop requires fealty to the crown. Well, if you're not going to swear fealty to the crown, then you can't be consecrated as a bishop unless you go to another bishop who doesn't owe fealty to the crown. We ship our bishops off to Scotland. And there, our first couple of bishops are consecrated by non-juring Scottish bishops who do not owe immediate fealty to the English crown. There, now we've got bishops. So now we can continue the apostolic tradition in the way that we've received it. So that's going on. At the same time the prayer book is coming into effect, we get a revision of that prayer book in 1892, a few slight modifications here and there. We get another revision in 1928. Many of you are probably familiar with that. Many of you might have grown up with that. I remember that myself. And then in 1979, there is a major revision that is published. Those of you who grew up with the 28 know that the 79 is a different animal. The reason the 79 looks so different, I've outlined some of the reasons there at the bottom of the outline, is because between, say, the mid-19th century throughout the 20th century, there's a tremendous amount of interest in recovering ancient forms of worship, not just in the Episcopal Church, but in basically the whole Western Church. The Roman Catholic Church is going to town on liturgical renewal and liturgical research and new historical and archaeological stuff, and we're kind of going back to the sources and retranslating things and looking at the way that ancient forms of worship inform contemporary forms of worship. That's happening for over a 100-year period there. And the 1979 prayer book bears witness to the way that we receive all of that. We take the fruits of all of that scholarship and all that learning and say, okay, well, that's going to shape our worship in these ways. So you have in the 79 a decided commitment towards recovering ancient rites and forms of worship. For example, Eucharistic Prayer D, that prayer of St. Basil that I mentioned, won't find that in the 28. You've got an attempt to integrate the fruits of the liturgical movement of the 19th and 20th centuries, and you have the beginnings of what I've identified here as a missional ecclesiology. Even in 79, the church is beginning to sense that the relationship to the culture and the relationship to the social and political environment is starting to shift. So we need to begin thinking about ourselves as the people of God in slightly different ways. We now conceive of ourselves as a people who are no longer part of a single unified social, political, cultural, religious establishment. We're a people who in some ways are called apart, but not so far apart that we disassociate from the social, political, cultural environment. We are a people on mission. We are called to go out and to be salt and to be light and to serve as the hands and feet of Christ. That starts to show up, that kind of emerging awareness on the part of the church starts to show up in the 79 prayer book in the way that we talk about pretty much everything, baptism, Eucharist, all the rest of it. Okay, that was 2,000 years of history in about 40 minutes. So I'm sorry that was as quick as it was, but there we are. Any initial thoughts, questions? Yeah, please.
Andrew, in delegates, and if not, was there a certain part of this country that was pushing for the revision?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. Let me think about this for a minute. The thing that was probably, well, I don't know, maybe, I may be painting with too big a brush here. The thing that probably drove that conversation the most, or drove it to a significant degree, had to do with the question that had already emerged in the church between high church observance and low church observance. Right? There was already kind of this ongoing, and this goes back to the 19th century, there was already in Anglicanism, broadly speaking, the low church evangelical approach to Anglican faith and practice. And especially after the Oxford movement and the emergence of the liturgical renewal movement and all the rest in the latter half of the 19th century, early 20s, there was the high church Anglo-Catholic movement. And the evangelical, low church, Anglo-Catholic, high church parties were kind of contesting for the soul of the Episcopal Church for, I don't know, a period of time there. That tension was, I think, probably played more of a role in how this developed than did, say, competition between the church in the Northeast and the church in the South, or the church in the East and the church in the West, or the church in the rural areas and the church in the urban areas. I don't know that that way of slicing the demographic pie might have had as much influence as the church party's way of slicing the pie. That's a very superficial answer. Don't take that to the bank, but that's the best I got for right now. So, but yeah, I mean, your question raises the issue of who drives the bus, right? Because, I mean, obviously, given the way all of this stuff, we recognize all this stuff connects, anytime you have a conversation about the prayer book, the way that you set the tone for the conversation, the kinds of things you discuss, will have profound implications for everything, right? I mean, you can't have, I think I said this a couple weeks ago, you can't have a neutral discussion about baptism. You can't have a neutral discussion about Eucharist or whatever, because it's all connected. So the means we use to set up the discussion and the language we use to set up the discussion will have a determinative influence, not just on the discussion, but on all the connecting points to which the discussion is related, which is one reason why we so often go to war with one another about this stuff. Please?
About the 1928 prayer book, did some churches not accept it? It seems like some. I mean, what was up with that? What did they not like about the change?
Yeah. Were there churches who...
Using the 1928.
Yeah, right. Well, I don't think, if I'm going to go back to the superficial thing. If the tension between the low church evangelicals and the high church Anglo-Catholics is at all useful as a way of thinking about how we got the prayer book we got, it's probably fair to say that the Anglo-Catholics won, for the most part, because we have things now like weekly Eucharist. And we have things like candles on the altar and vestments and all the processions. My goodness, all the stuff that we take for granted as part and parcel of what happens when you come to church bears more of a resemblance to that form of piety and practice than it would have classical low church evangelical Anglicanism. So one reason that some places didn't adapt the 79 as quickly as others had to do with that issue. And some of the theological questions and some of the theological differences between the more high church Anglo-Catholic party and the low church evangelical party on questions like, say, justification, how we understand salvation, or how we think, whatever. Some of those differences also affected the way different churches, different dioceses received the book. Even the lectionary kind of became a point of contention at certain points, because the lectionary shifts. Right, the content of the lectionary. So now we were reading this much scripture, and now it looks like we're reading less scripture. So you want to get us away from the Bible. So we don't like that lectionary, so we're not taking the prayer book. Whatever. Anything can be turned into an occasion for argument. Right? So yeah, did we? I don't want to overstate this. Did we disenfranchise some people when we adopted this? I don't know that we disenfranchised them, but I don't know that we did as good a job as we might have done helping people recognize how this represented a continuation and a fulfillment of the tradition rather than a sharp break. And that was one of the things, I mean, I think fair to say that, I mean, the 79 was kind of described as a sharp break. Hey, now we've got it right. This is, now we've kind of recovered ancient forms of worship, and now we're finally tracking in the right direction. Well, when you use that kind of language, it's hard to bring people along, right? Before we go, let me just note, there is no class next week because of our observance of the Feast of St. Michael, so no class next week. We'll pick up again the first Sunday of October, okay? If anyone has thoughts or questions they want to discuss after today's conversation, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, thank you all for your time today.